After more than 40 years, Britain has voted to end its membership of the European Union.
An extraordinary moment in British history.
Les électeurs britanniques se sont prononcés en faveur du Brexit.
We end this referendum with the country more divided than it was at the start of the referendum.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week.
The British people have made a very clear decision.
Britain votes out of the EU. What role did the media play in the referendum? Facebook has a new head of communications in Israel, plucked straight out of the ranks of the Netanyahu government, covering war and now peace in Colombia as the world's longest conflict comes to an end. And the power of suggestion. Google's autocomplete, the drop-down box that can tell you what people think of other people. Usually, journalists cover the news. On rare occasions, they cover history. That was the case in Britain this past week when the UK became the first country in the history of the European Union to vote to leave the EU. The political fallout was instantaneous. Prime Minister David Cameron resigned, as he said he would, if he failed to lead the Remain camp to victory. The markets also spoke quickly, clearly. The British pound tumbled to a level not seen in 30 years. Here at The Listening Post, we get beyond the politics, the economics, and focus on the media side of the story. And in a vote this close, it was 52 to 48. The coverage of the campaign can make all the difference. Both sides played the fear card shamelessly. Fear of the economic consequences of leaving from one campaign, fear of immigration from the other. And the headlines reflected that, printed in newspapers that took sides. Those papers spent far too much time on the horse race, the personalities, the he said, she said, and not enough time on fact-checking and policy. And one personality, Boris Johnson, the most prominent voice in the Leave camp, is a big part of the narrative, going back to his days as a newspaper reporter based in Brussels. Back then, as a journalist, he belittled the EU. This past week, as a politician, he may have dealt it a mortal blow. Our starting point is London. With the polls closing at 10 p.m. and a close vote expected, the talking heads knew they were in for a long night. 6.5 hours and more than 30 million votes later came the verdict.
And Sky News is projecting that the UK has voted out.
We can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
The broadcasters had done their job. And a few hours after that, there was Prime Minister Cameron in front of the cameras, resigning from his.
I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
On the simple question of in or out, this was a campaign of puzzling ups and downs. The early polls had the Remain side with a clear lead, then the Leave side surged ahead before Remain came back to draw even on the eve of the vote. The high number of undecideds right into the final days suggested the electorate was in a state of confusion, for which the campaign leaders and the media have all been blamed.
The experts warn us we will have a smaller economy, less employment, lower wages, and therefore a huge hole in our public finances.
Cameron, who led the Remain campaign, often resorted to economic prophecies of doom should Britain leave the EU, to the extent his rivals called the Remain campaign Project Fear. And the newspapers that went all in on the Leave side, including Rupert Murdoch's son, as well as the Daily Mail, have been accused of echoing misinformation from the campaign that wanted out.
The main one has been the idea that we send £350 million a week to Brussels. This has been shown to be not correct. We have a rebate from the money that we send to Brussels, so actually it comes down to about £240 million a week last year. But then if you then take into account the money we get back from Brussels, it's about £120 million a week of net costs.
It's like saying a Mars bar costs £1 because you go into a grocer's shop, you give the shopkeeper £1 for a Mars bar, and failing to mention that he gives you 35 pence back in change. Number two, that we can still have access to the single market, to a single market of 500 million consumers, without having to allow EU workers continued access to Britain.
Another one has been the the idea that Turkey is going to join the EU next week or any minute, and all of the whole population of Turkey is going to come over and take all our jobs. I think that's really been used by the Leave campaign to scare people. It's very unlikely that Turkey is going to join the EU, especially anytime soon.
Then came the day the campaign and the coverage of it were put on pause. The murder of Jo Cox, a pro-Remain, pro-immigration member of Parliament, at the hands of a man accused of shouting Britain first as he gunned her down, shocked voters, and the politicking was suspended for 3 days. Given what had preceded the killing, the stoking of fears over immigration by certain political figures, and the amplification of that message provided by certain newspapers, there were hopes that when the campaigning resumed, the rhetoric would get dialed back. Wrong.
I never heard such hogwash after the death of Jo Cox, with people saying the tone of the campaign now has to change and will change. I think the tone should have changed, but a day after Jo Cox's death, the day after campaigning was suspended, both sides were at it, hammer and tongs, punching the hell out of each other, hurling insults at each other.
The main difference in tone post the death of Jo Cox was not so much in the content of the argument. You still had The Sun trying to scare its readers into being against immigrants with its immigration, double-page spread in capital letters, whereas politicians and newspapers became slightly less personal. It was less about the individuals on either side of the argument.
Like Boris Johnson. Although he held no official title, the former mayor of London and presumed heir to 10 Downing Street was the de facto leader of the Leave campaign. Johnson is a media darling, part soundbite dispenser, part court jester. He revels in the skewering of the European Union, whose bureaucracy makes for an easy target.
This Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
Johnson knows the EU, having covered it in the early 1990s for the Daily Telegraph. Not one to dig deep into policy, which such a job usually requires, he opted for polemics. And through some clever writing, Johnson created a template for other Brussels-based journalists and UK-based politicians to follow.
Boris revolutionized the coverage of Brussels. Before he went there, it was sober, rather boring, admittedly, and balanced, and the EU was seen for what it was. What Boris did was wage a relentless campaign to mock, denigrate, lampoon the EU with every story he wrote. And editors on other papers saw what was happening and they thought this is much more interesting, and they started putting pressure on their own Brussels correspondents to follow suit.
Boris Johnson, as the Brussels correspondent of the Daily Telegraph in the 1990s, regularly attacked the excesses of the European Union. I'm not terribly sure those stories were true, but they were being fed by Boris Johnson, who continued to deploy those stories during the referendum campaign.
Boris was in effect campaigning against a cartoon caricature that he himself had created. A cartoon caricature that bore no relation to reality. A Europe of superplots.
The EU morphing relentlessly into a superstate.
A Europe of scheming Europeans trying to do down Britain.
I think we should take the chance now, as a country, to take back control.
And by and large, with a few honourable exceptions, the newspapers followed that narrative throughout the referendum campaign.
Both campaigns had a fear narrative they tried to sell. The Remain side stoked fears of the economic consequences of exiting the EU, backed by experts who were backed by data. The Leave side labeled that argument Project Fear. It countered with a fear of immigrants narrative, backed and sometimes led by the conservative tabloids. Remain argued it had the facts and the fact-checkers on its side, but up against all those headlines, all those images, facts can be a tough sell.
Laying out the facts to people is perhaps quite a kind of dry, sterile exercise, whereas I think the Leave campaign has always had a momentum in that it has been able to provide a sort of a romantic sense of Britain and the idea of leaving, and that hasn't always been based on the facts. Indeed, it has diverged from facts quite a lot. So I think for journalists who want to lay out the facts very clearly, but also engage their readers, that can also be difficult.
The UK media let the British voters down. It has fed the British people endless lies, endless propaganda about the EU, but I also think the media let itself down. At a time when they badly needed to restore their credibility, this was the moment when they could have proved their value, and with a few notable exceptions, they signally failed to do so.
Other media stories that are on our radar. 2 weeks ago, we reported on Australia's offshore refugee detention camps and the near impossible task that journalists face trying to report on the conditions there. Just this past week, an Australian television channel became the first to get a news crew into one of those camps, but not everyone considers it to be a win for journalism. There are 2 camps holding some 1,500 refugees, one on Mance Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea, the other on the island nation of Nauru. On the rare occasions that information gets out from the camps, usually leaked by ex-employees, it tells a story of despair, sexual assaults, and suicides amongst the refugees. But in a segment called An Exclusive Look Inside Nauru, Australia's Channel 9 and its program, A Current Affair, painted a far more benign picture.
And the TV, you bought the TV here?
No, they gave us.
They gave you a TV?
Yeah, everything they gave us.
Okay.
The Channel 9 report also did not square with what a trauma specialist who worked at the camp but was fired after speaking out told The Guardian Australia this past week. Channel 9's parent company is chaired by Peter Costello, a former cabinet minister in the Australian government. The Turkish government keeps finding new and innovative ways to put journalists in jail. One of the papers there, a pro-Kurdish publication called Özgür Gündem, brought in 3 guest editors earlier this month who were put in charge of the paper's output for 1 day. It's all part of a solidarity campaign that began last month to protest the government's policy of censoring Özgür Gündem. One of those involved was Erol Ondoroğlu, the Turkish representative for the Paris-based NGO Reporters Without Borders. He was joined by journalist Ahmed Nesin and an academic, Şebnem Korur Fincancı, who heads Turkey's Human Rights Foundation. All 3 were then arrested June 20th on charges of disseminating terrorist propaganda. Over the course of this campaign, Özgür Gündem has had a total of 44 guest editors. According to another paper, Hürriyet Daily, 37 of them are now under investigation, which did not seem to put off Can Dündar, the editor of Cumhuriyet. Dündar's currently appealing a 5-year prison sentence for revealing state secrets. He guest edited Özgür Gündem June 21st, the day after the other 3 were charged. It was one of those appointments that would not normally draw much attention. Facebook's hiring of a new head of policy and communications for its operation in Israel. Except that the appointee is Jordana Cutler, currently chief of staff at the Israeli embassy in Washington and a longtime advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Israeli government has repeatedly demanded that Facebook monitor and delete pro-Palestinian content that it says encourages violence. Over the past 8 months, Israel has arrested 150 Palestinians over Facebook posts that it called incitement. Cutler's hiring has triggered concerns that she is now in a position to silence critical voices online in the name of Israeli security. Among those concerned is the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, or BDS movement, a global nonviolent organization opposing the occupation whose viral videos often expose Israeli human rights violations. Now to a news story that's been a long time coming. After more than 5 decades of conflict and 4 years of negotiating, the Colombian government and guerrilla leaders from the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, have signed a peace agreement. President Juan Manuel Santos and FARC leader Rodrigo Londoño made the announcement in Havana, where the Cuban government had hosted the talks, ending the world's longest-running war, one that had claimed more than 220,000 lives, left another 45,000 people missing, and displaced upwards of 6 million. Ever since 2012, when the talks began, many on the Colombian right have been skeptical of the peace process, a skepticism that much of the mainstream media have been willing to share. To counter that, the FARC began waging their own media campaign, partly from Cuba, to undermine what they see as a war on terror narrative and to recast themselves as a legitimate political party. President Santos has vowed to put the deal to a referendum, and voters will need to know what's on the table. They'll be counting on the Colombian news media for balance and context. Will they get it? The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro talks to journalists in Bogota and FARC rebels turned reporters in Havana about the media's role in the Colombian peace process.
El grupo terrorista de las FARC. Tune into the mainstream news coverage on the peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, and you'll get this.
Las contradicciones de las FARC que, al mismo tiempo que negocian un modelo de paz en Cuba con el gobierno colombiano, en Colombia intensifican su acción terrorista.
Click onto Nueva Colombia, the New Colombia, a news channel set up on YouTube by the FARC themselves, and you'll get this.
Se acerca el fin de la guerra. Importantes avances hacia el logro de un acuerdo de cese el fuego y hostilidades.
Los únicos que transmitían eran los medios de comunicación grandes.
The mainstream networks were covering this 24/7. They were the only ones with the funds and resources needed to keep journalists here waiting for the news to happen. We were the actual source of the news. We needed to do the reporting ourselves. The question was how. The internet was the only way to do this quickly. And that's how we've started doing what we're doing now, explaining to people what our political project is all about, and doing this in a clear, engaging way.
Duramos mucho tiempo invisibilizados.
For a long time, we were invisible. We weren't really able to get the FARC's message out there, to communicate our values and ideology. All we could do was to fight with our guns, to repel the continuous attacks. Communication suffered, though. We just didn't have the opportunity. Once we had all the comforts of a studio, you can imagine the difference between being out there in the jungle to being here in the city. Here we have all the equipment, the internet, social media, Facebook and Twitter accounts, the YouTube channel, the whole lot.
Todas las redes habidas y por ahí.
The FARC's press wing, former guerrillas turned broadcasters operating out of Havana, Cuba, may be telegenic, but they're only getting a few thousand clicks a week.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Somos Nueva Colombia Noticias, informando para la paz desde la capital cubana.
But most Colombians get their news from the big TV and radio stations, RCN, Caracol, NTN 24, privately owned outlets that have millions of viewers. They've been telling the story of a conflict over land rights, which has pitted Marxist rebels claiming to fight on behalf of the country's peasants, but whose rebellion runs on drugs profits, against government and paramilitary forces. After 6 decades of this conflict, Colombians are sick and tired of the violence. While the government tries to de-escalate the language of war,
en lugar de decirles estos bandidos narcotraficantes, terroristas, pues referirse a las FARC.
the media have insisted on ramping it up.
No decirles narcotraficantes, bueno, tienen negocio de narcotraficantes, no decirles criminales, cometen crímenes y atroces todos los días.
Son muy pocos los medios de comunicación que
There are very few media outlets who are currently thinking about reconciliation, partly because the media reflects something that is self-evident. This country is not yet ready for reconciliation. Every time one raises the issue, people don't understand it. It's only the victims. The media have a lot of work to do on this. They are too scared of letting go of polarized narratives that are easier, more comfortable to tell.
Salir de la polarización, que es más fácil y confortable.
Las FARC han sido vistas.
The FARC have been seen, not just in Colombia, but all over the world, as a terrorist group. To dissociate them from drug trafficking, from kidnapping and extortion, from forced child recruitment and human rights abuses is very difficult. That background is what has made the negotiation so difficult, because for a sector of the population, the FARC will always be a criminal gang with no political agenda.
Sin ningún componente político.
Las FARC solo se le mira desde sus delitos.
The FARC are only considered from the perspective of their crimes. No one takes into account their ideals or the political positions they stand for. The narrative is steeped in legality and criminality.
El gobierno y las FARC anunciaron hace pocos minutos un acuerdo que obligaría al grupo criminal a liberar de sus filas a los menores de 15 años.
I think it's a narrative that has been strongly depoliticized. Of course, it's not a narrative that has been completely invented, as the FARC claims. They have perpetrated criminal acts which are not appropriate for a revolutionary or a political organization.
Una organización política.
One man who's done his best to undermine the FARC's legitimacy is Colombia's former president, Álvaro Uribe. During his time in office, Uribe waged an aggressive war against the FARC. Plan Colombia, it was called, a $9 billion campaign funded by the US. It was post 9/11, and the narrative was the war on terror. In 2010, Uribe handpicked his successor, Juan Manuel Santos, his defense minister. But when Santos staked his presidency on signing a peace deal with the rebels, Uribe became his most powerful opponent. Since then, he's been waging a one-man Twitter war against Santos and the peace talks. And with more than 4 million followers and the ear of the mainstream media, his message has a significant impact.
Álvaro Uribe es una figura emblemática.
Álvaro Uribe is an emblematic figure in Colombia and a natural-born communicator. His positions regarding the peace process always generate interest in Colombia. He has been clearly against the process. He has put many obstacles in front of it and led the opposition against it.
His strategy of sabotaging the peace process is a strategy steeped in lies. He does this on Twitter, and this has an immediate impact on the media. This creates headlines. It becomes compulsory to talk to Uribe. And I think this has been the main factor in creating a public opinion that is against the peace process. The
narrative of war imposed by Uribe has changed the way we do journalism here in a big way. If I interview FARC leaders, I can't do a simple interview like this. I have to be hard on them, as if they don't deserve to be seated there. This is the result of the war narrative. It forces Colombian journalists to be very hard on the FARC for fear of being stigmatized as guerrilla-friendly journalists.
Estigmatizados como si fuéramos periodistas de la guerrilla.
That stigma persists, and moving the story on, covering a peace deal with an adversary long considered the enemy, is proving a challenge.
Cuando comenzamos, seguíamos en guerra.
When the talks began, war was still being waged by the media, so we were a bit reluctant to engage with them because we were fed up with the harassment and slandering. We felt like the cameras were guns being pointed at us. We've been asking them to tone it down and to acknowledge their active role in the conflict. So at least now we've gone from terrorists to insurgents, which is progress, I suppose.
Que eso de todas maneras es un avance.
A uno le costó mucho trabajo abrir camino.
At the start of the talks, it was very hard for me to have access to the FARC. They didn't want to give me an interview because they consider the media to go against everything they stand for. That's been changing, little by little. They've come to see that there are nuances, and that there are journalists reporting what's happening in Havana, who understand that the FARC need to have a media presence and to voice their opinion. This has been a mutual learning curve. It's a shame that the other media have not done the same.
Lástima que no lo hayan hecho los demás medios.
And probably won't for a while. And that's a problem for Colombians, because it's not just politicians who can broker peace. In a society scarred by war, the media also have a role to produce responsible accounts of the past, to show what's at stake in the present, for society to make its decision for the future.
Finally, can you remember life before Google autocomplete? That drop-down box that when you enter a search term attempts to fill in the rest of your search. It's not reading your mind, it's based on what people have searched before you. And it's geo-specific. It all depends on where you are. In the UK, for instance, type in "why is Germany" and Google suggests "so powerful." Go to Japan and type in China and just watch "bad manners" come up. In that respect, Google autocomplete provides insights into what various nationalities think of some of their neighbors. We put together a few examples of autocomplete suggestions, and the results are not exactly diplomatic. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.